Hi, my name is Lydia Moland. I teach philosophy at Colby College in Waterville, Maine, and I wanted to make this quick video introducing you to a non-canonical philosopher named Lydia Maria Child. Um, Lydia Maria Child was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts, and she died in 1880 in Wayland, Massachusetts. She achieved very early fame for writing a novel when she was still in her early 20s called Hobbamock. It was a novel about Native Americans and had some very progressive ideas about the way Native Americans should be treated. Um, she built on that fame by becoming the first editor of a children's periodical in the United States called the Juvenile Miscellany, and also by publishing this book, The Frugal Housewife, which stayed in print for many, many generations and is a kind of self-help book. So there are recipes, instructions about how to cure various illnesses, how to can things, how to store things, how to eat healthily. And part of what I love about it is that it's also a statement about democracy. So she's trying to convince her fellow Americans that in order for a democracy to function, people need to be resilient and self-reliant, not become an aristocracy, etc. All of those books were extremely successful. She was famous and beloved by her early 30s. And then she had an encounter with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who convinced her that slavery was the greatest evil her country had ever engaged in, and that her immediate duty was to fight it. This was at a time when your average American, also in the North, maybe was opposed to slavery, but really didn't think they could do anything about it, and were convinced by politicians and religious leaders that slavery wasn't so bad after all. So after she had this kind of conversion experience where she realized the full horrors of slavery, she went away for about 3 years, read every book she could get on the subject, and in 1833 published this book called An Appeal in Favor of that class of Americans known as Africans. This book was it was the first book-length condemnation of slavery written in the United States. It was a total scandal. People were furious. They couldn't believe that she had disrupted or threatened to disrupt the American economy, which was dependent on slavery, American politics, which was dependent on um, agreement between North and South. She was arguing against religious leaders. She was arguing against the patriarchy. And it's an extremely philosophical work. So she uses very dense argumentation, but also very accessible argumentation. She anticipates her readers' objections and dismantles them one by one. Her final chapter is about the moral guilt that Northerners also share for their part in sustaining slavery. So it was no wonder that it made her neighbors very angry. So she struggled then for really the rest of her career with the reputation of being a radical, but she continued to publish. Before this, she published a 2-volume history of women. She published a 3-volume history of religion. She published a couple of biographies. She was the first woman editor of a major United States newspaper, the National Anti-Slavery Standard, in the 1840s. And she continued to wage a war with her pen against slavery until it was abolished in 1865, at which point she turned her attention back to wrongs suffered by Native Americans, also the recently enslaved people, in the way they, now being freed, were being treated and abandoned by the government, and also harassed in very violent ways in the South. So I haven't even scratched the surface of all the things that she wrote. She also wrote a couple of other novels. She wrote poems, including the famous American Thanksgiving poem, Over the River and Through the Woods. And her life to me is really an example of a life lived with philosophical rigor. So she was very interested in justice and equality and consistency. So she wanted people to recognize when they were using bad arguments, hypocritical arguments, inconsistent arguments to justify living their lives the same way when there was evil all around them in the form of slavery. So she also, in many of her letters, she clearly read philosophy. She references philosophy. She talks about Kant and Hegel, Spinoza, Novalis, Jean-Paul. So she was very well read in philosophy of her generation as well. So I think that the appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans is a wonderful text to teach. And her life in general is a wonderful testament to what it means to live philosophically, to think philosophically, and to encourage others to do the same. Thanks.